Welcome back to the class video for Module 7, in which we're looking at Thomas Paine's Common Sense. In the first part of this class, we looked at Paine's historical context and the radicalization of the revolutionary movement from 1773 to 1776, and we noted how different was Paine's purpose and context compared to Dickinson's. Dickinson wrote like a lawyer, dissecting the language of parliamentary statutes and calling upon fundamental principles of the British Constitution for the purpose of claiming rights under the British Constitution. Right? Dickinson is ultimately trying to reconcile the colonial protests to the British imperial order. That's not Thomas Paine, right? Thomas Paine is writing a call to arms to his fellow citizens to go grab their muskets off the fireplace and grab their gear and march off and sign up for the Continental Army or one of the state militias. He is not trying to reconcile colonial claims with a British Constitution. He is trying to describe a new source of sovereignty that the colonials, now Americans, can draw upon to create their own independent governments. So Paine is going to write with broad philosophical constructs. He's not particularly tied to the language of specific statutes and whatnot. And his language is going to be emotional because he's trying to rile his fellow citizens up with enough anger towards the British to be ready to go to war. With that context in mind, then, what we are looking for is the way in which Paine sort of freely grabs willy-nilly these key terms, key concepts from the social contract tradition without much regard to whether they're Lockean or Rousseauian. He sort of is grabbing at will and constructing a new American mythology around the state of nature. Nowhere is that kind of mishmash of freely drawn natural law concepts more evident than in the famous opening paragraphs. So let's look here at the first paragraph, the first two paragraphs of Paine's Common Sense. He begins, "Some writers have so confounded society with government as to leave little or no distinction between them, whereas they are not only different, but have different origins. Society is produced by our wants, and government by our wickedness. The former promotes our happiness positively by uniting our affections, the latter negatively by restraining our vices. The one encourages intercourse, the other creates distinctions. The first is a patron, the last a punisher." This distinction between society and government then culminates for Paine in this classically American summation. This is so archetypically American attitude towards government in the first line of the next paragraph. "Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one." You could not come up with a more classically American summation of the role of government. At its best, it's a necessary evil. At worst, it's an intolerable one. But there is this ambiguity at the heart of that observation, right? Why is government evil? Is it government that's evil, or government's reflection of our own evil, right? It restrains our wickedness. It restrains our vices. It is us that is evil, which creates our ambivalent attitudes towards government, because what we see in the necessary functions of government is a reflection of our own vices and evil. And so there is this wonderful summation here in the next highlighted passage Government, like dress, is the badge of lost innocence. That's a wonderful line to hang on to. It is a reference, of course, to the book of Genesis in the Old Testament and the story of Adam and Eve. When they take a bite from the apple of knowledge, the thing that they become aware of is that they are naked. Right? And as soon as they become aware of that, they have to start wearing clothes because they're embarrassed of their own nakedness. That is, they lost their innocence by coming into knowledge of their own sinful desires. So this is a wonderful example of why Paine is a popular writer, why he can speak to the masses, if you will, in a way that a writer like John Dickinson could never persuade, because Dickinson is narrow and legalistic and dissecting technical language, where Paine comes up with these metaphors that resonate with the revolutionary religious culture that we just referenced in the first part of the class. Government, like dress, is the badge of lost innocence. Well, those are our sinful desires, right? It's our lost innocence. So let's take a moment to think about the relationship here between society and government and illustrate it. Paine's foundational claim is that we have to distinguish between society and government, right? Other writers have confounded these two things, and that's led us to be confused and not understand American liberty. We gotta clearly distinguish between them if we're gonna understand the proper origins of government. And if we list the attributes that he ascribes to each, we see very clearly society embodies all of our good qualities, right? All the things that are great about us. And government embodies all of our bad qualities, all the things that are terrible about us. In this distinction and list of attributes, we have a perfect illustration of the mishmash of Lockean and Rousseauian concepts. Of course, the distinction between society and government is the foundational building block of Rousseau's model. If you recall our discussion of Locke's second treatise, he nowhere distinguishes between society and government until the final chapter of the work in chapter 19, when he's nervous about granting you the right of revolution and worried that you're going to think he's a radical and it'll be the end of all order and society. He says, oh no, we have to distinguish between the dissolution of government and the dissolution of society. In that context, even though he does not explicitly say it, it's clear that the inference is society is the household relationships, that is, the subordination of wife to husband, child to parent, servant to master, and slave to lord. And in his moment of anxiety, granting the right of revolution, Locke is trying to reassure us, well, I don't mean that those subordinate relationships will no longer be in effect just because we're overthrowing government. But it's a last-minute addition as he's trying to patch together contradictions in his theory. For Rousseau, of course, the distinction between society and government, remember, the agreement by which a people becomes a people prior to choosing a government, is the foundational conceptual model, right? It's about that self-alienation to your cultural preferences. So on a superficial or kind of first reading of these famous opening paragraphs of A Common Sense, he seems to be making clearly a Rousseauian distinction that is not Lockean, except if you recall from Rousseau that self-alienation to your culture is the fulfillment and the growth of all that is good in you, right? It's the exact opposite set of attributes. That is to say, in the state of nature, you are wicked and full of vice, and you're a punisher and violence rules. And when you join society, you become, right, a full human. You gain all the attributes of which you are possible. Rousseau does not have the idea that we are naturally good. We are naturally bestial. We're a stupid and unimaginative animal in the state of nature. And so society and then government pulls out of us things of which we were not capable before. By insisting on this duality in our own internal nature, that we are both affectionate, right, and wanting intercourse with our neighbors, but also wicked and full of vice at the same time. By creating that duality of our inner nature, Paine is clearly calling on a Lockean tradition and not a Rousseauian tradition. You could easily ask the question here, well, why is society so good if we are so wicked and vicious? Right? Both Hobbes and Rousseau have a simple answer to that. We're not good, right? We are just wicked. But it's Locke, uniquely among the social contract theorists, that is never able to resolve that conflict about human nature. He thinks at one moment we're rational and cooperative, and at the next moment are maybe others of us, right? Maybe it's some people and other people, but more likely it is our own self-judgment distorting our reason in our natural setting. Now, even though there's a kind of mishmash of social contract models here, there is a kind of cultural logic if we think about Paine's historical context, as we discussed in the first part of class. That is to say, Paine is not trying to claim British rights for British subjects under the British Constitution like Dickinson was. Paine is trying to discover a source of sovereignty that the colonists can draw upon to create their own new independent governments. The Rousseauian model gives you that opportunity, right? It says, identify with what it is to be an American, and that's the thing that can be the source of sovereignty to create a new government. But the problem is, there is no cultural identity of being an American. That is, as colonists, if you lived in Massachusetts or Pennsylvania or Virginia or the Carolinas, you were far more likely to identify with people who lived in Britain as fellow British in your cultural preferences than you were to imagine if you lived in Virginia that you had something in common with someone who lived in Massachusetts. So Paine needs to create an aura of, if you will, positivity. He needs to imagine that there is such a thing as an American identity. What is that thing? It's all the things that are most wonderful about us. And so identifying government as the source of evil projects that antipathy onto the British Parliament. He's not particularly concerned at this moment about the constitutional conventions that are going to follow. He's trying to urge his fellow citizens to resistance. So this dichotomy makes rhetorical sense, even if it mishmashes the conceptual models that we've been looking at. And this conflict between Lockean and Rousseauian principles, it becomes even more acute, even more obvious and direct in the next portion of the text, which is so radically individualistic, right? And we'll explain that. Now let's turn back and continue with the text. Okay, having laid out these basic categories, society and government, in the introductory paragraphs, Paine is now going to give us his kind of paraphrasing or summation of the Lockean story of how government derives from the state of nature. At the top of the right-hand column of page 2, Paine writes, "In order to gain a clear and just idea of the design and end of government, let us suppose a small number of persons settled in some sequestered part of the earth, unconnected with the rest. They will then represent the first peopling of any country or of the world. In this state of natural liberty, society will be their first thought. 1,000 motives will excite them thereto." And if you follow in the next paragraph, "Thus necessity, like a gravitating power, would soon form our newly arrived immigrants into society." Everything is good in the beginning, but eventually, in the final highlighted passage, they will begin to relax in their duty and attachment to each other, and this remissness will point out the necessity of establishing some form of government to supply the defect of moral virtue, hence a reference back to our lost innocence. Now we can notice the kind of Rousseauian role that society plays here in this story. That is to say, society is their first thought. 1,000 motives excite them thereto. Or even, most dramatically, necessity, like a gravitating power, soon forms our immigrants into society. We talked about the contrast between Lockean and Rousseauian notions of consent. And for Rousseau, consent is not something that you consciously agree to, that is the consent to the social compact that creates a people, but it's a self-alienation. It's something that you are sort of absorbed into without getting a choice one way or the other. It's your intuitive impulses that make you part of one people and not part of another. So when Rousseau says that society is your first thought, or that you're driven to society by necessity like a gravitating power, that's a kind of homage to that Rousseauian notion of consent. But despite that kind of Rousseauian thread or theme embedded here, the overall portrait is fundamentally Lockean. First and most importantly, as we've just been observing about the introduction, because it's rooted in this ambiguity or ambivalence about human nature. It contains this duality. We're drawn to society because of all the things that are wonderful about ourselves, because we're reasonable and cooperative, but we must have government because we have this other side of our nature, which is vicious and aggressive and irrational. And so in that duality, which Rousseau, of course, would have rejected. Rousseau would not have recognized that these first inhabitants would have been fully human at all. They would have been bestial until they became a people. And so this is a very different kind of, a very specifically Lockean portrait of the origin story. And you see how naturally this language or this series of images fits with the uniquely British North American experience. Paine is writing to communities of people who understand the origins of their own communities as pioneers carving farms out of the wilderness. And so this story or this narrative of the origins of governmental authority that was written over or almost a century prior seems to be uniquely designed to tell the story of British North America. But the most predominantly or exaggeratedly Lockean trait in Paine's portrait here comes on the next page when he describes this first government. He says at the top of the left-hand column on page 3, "Some convenient tree will afford them a state house, under the branches of which the whole colony may assemble to deliberate on public matters. It is more than probable that their first laws will have the title only of regulations, and be enforced by no other penalty than public disesteem. In this first parliament, every man, by natural right, will have a seat." The foundational right of government that creates the powers that we embed in government is each person's individual right to consent. Right? In the first parliament, every man, by natural right, will have a seat. The government is an expression of my individual right to consent. That emphasis is obscured on page 2, that is in the introduction and the beginning portrait of the origins of society. To the extent that that Paine wants to talk about society, to the extent that he wants to create an origin story for American culture, that cuts against the individual right of each person to consent. And we've seen that modal distinction in the contrast between Locke and Rousseau. Locke places great emphasis on each individual person's right to consent. Rousseau would not agree with this phrase from Paine that in the first Parliament, every man by natural right will have a seat. No man in Rousseau, no individual person in Rousseau has a right to anything. Only the collective has a right to things, right? So this would be a nonsensical statement coming from Rousseau. But you see how within the cultural context of the British North American colonies, this mishmash of Rousseauian Lockean images makes peculiar cultural logic or cultural sense in this setting. Now, your individual right to consent to every single law, we describe this as a simple democracy. In a simple democracy, every person in the society would have a right to say yes or no about every rule. But of course, as soon as you get more than a few people in a community, that becomes impractical. And so government involves the transfer of your right to say yes or no to every individual law to another person who's going to exercise that right on your behalf, not because it's not your right, but merely because it's inconvenient with the size of the community as it grows for everybody to get together to say yes or no on every single law. It's a mere mechanical transfer of your individual right. In the next paragraph, Paine writes, "But as the colony increases, the public concerns will increase likewise, and the distance at which the members may be separated will render it too inconvenient for all of them to meet on every occasion as at first, when their number was small, their habitations near, and the public concerns few and trifling. This will point out the convenience of their consenting to leave the legislative part to be managed by a select number chosen from the whole body, who are supposed to have the same concerns at stake as those who have appointed them, and who will act in the same manner as the whole body would act were they present. Representatives are merely, if you will, proxy voters. You were going to vote yes on this law. You're going to hand over your ballot to your representative to cast on your behalf, right? There should be no difference between the interest of the electors and the representatives who represent them, so that the principle of direct democracy can be transferred on a larger scale. This will be the core principle of the state constitutions written during the Revolutionary period, and which we'll look at in Module 8. This mandate from Paine in the next highlighted passage, and that the elected might never form to themselves an interest separate from the electors. Prudence will point out the propriety of having elections often. Indeed, the most prominent feature of those state constitutions is their obsession with elections, and we'll talk about that in Module 8. But here let's summarize Paine's portrait of a simple or natural government at the top of the right-hand column of 3. Here then is the origin and rise of government, namely a mode rendered necessary by the inability of moral virtue to govern the world. Here too is the design and end of government, viz., freedom and security." We see here how clearly he is in the frame of the conceptual models of Locke and Rousseau, right? What is the great holy grail of the social contract? Is to secure freedom and security. But Paine's notion of the transfer of direct democracy through representation will both become an American obsession, as we'll see. This is the central conceptual problem that the American Constitution writers are going to try to resolve. We will see that in the next module, but for our purposes here, it shows how acutely is the conceptual dilemma here in the conflict between Lockean and Rousseauian definitions. And let's turn back to our illustration to try to get our arms wrapped around that. As we come then to the end of this first movement within common sense, we observe that we've gotten two pairs of dichotomous categories. We were introduced at first to the distinction between society and government, and then now that we turn to government, we see that there's these two types, or this fundamental turn in the nature of government, right? So simple government, or what we could describe as that government which immediately derives from nature and the formation of society, is when each person gets to exercise their natural right to consent to each law. Paine does not call it unnatural, but there's a fundamental change that happens at the moment that you are no longer allowed to do that, and you have to hand over that right to someone else to do it on your behalf. We might think of this as civic or unnatural government, but there the right to consent is exercised by elected representatives. As we think about these two pairings, first society versus government, and then below this kind of simple natural government and this elected government or unnatural government, we want to make kind of a Linnaean category of it, right? First we have a broader definition, and then we have a subcategory of one of the first types, except that what we notice about the pairing between types of government is that it lacks all of the moral qualities that were first and foremost in distinguishing society from government. Above all, society is good, right, and government is bad. But it's not replicated here in this division between government. Natural government or simple government is clearly good. He says that it would merely be public disesteem would be the only necessary form of punishment or enforcement of these laws. So there, in this natural form of government, Paine proposes that we all just sort of get along. When we elect representatives to exercise our natural rights on our behalf, Paine does not then say, well, that's the place where we have to deal with the troublemakers, right? He does not, which would be the logical conclusion of this distinction between society and government. The model implies, well, they're all of the wicked and the vicious and the punishers. Well, what is government punishing? It's got to be the wickedness and the vices. Isn't that the place where we hand over to the elected representative the obligation to allow the right decision to go through and restrain those of us who are wicked and vicious? But Paine does not describe it that way. He says that the representatives are going to have exactly the same interest as the people whose rights they are exercising. So there is this difference in the dichotomies, whereas the dichotomy between society and government is clearly meant to indicate one embodies all of our good qualities and the other embodies all of our bad qualities. It's not replicated here. That dichotomy is not accounted for here in this underlying division, simple government versus elected government. And so it raises a conceptual question. If you imagine a representative or a delegate being elected by, say, 100 people, and that delegate's responsibility is to vote exactly as each one of those 100 people would vote if they had the opportunity to come to the assembly and exercise their own natural right, what necessarily must be true about the 100 people in order for the delegate to achieve his mission, right? That the delegate only has one vote. If there's any disagreement among their constituents, it is not possible for the delegate to accurately represent the natural right of each individual person to consent to the law. It embodies conflict. Only if you had a united consensus within the culture, within the society about what the right decision would be, only if 100 people agreed with it, could the delegate succeed in his responsibility to accurately represent each person's natural right. So there is an inherent conceptual problem in the idea of representation. And this problem is going to be the central focus for virtually the remainder of the course. It's the core idea that the American constitutional writers are trying to resolve. And we're going to watch a narrative of this idea evolve, first through this revolutionary state constitutions, and then a movement back in the federal constitution. Here, this is a good place to pause this segment of the course. We really have two more big movements within common sense, and we'll cut here and we'll pick up in the next segment and try to do those two movements in the last portion of the course for Module 7.